So I'd like to welcome everyone to the first meeting of the branch of the Classical Association here in North Staffs. And we're very pleased to have with us my colleague from Manchester, Dr. Tom Phillips. Tom was going to come to us physically. He was then stopped, but we've managed to get him here virtually, which I hope we'll all enjoy. And perhaps Tom will enjoy it so much that one day he'll come back and visit us physically. He's going to speak to us on picturing Ovid, myth in art, and at this point, I'll hand over to Tom.
Thanks very much, Andy. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Good, super. Well, of course, this is normally the point at which one says, you know, it's lovely to be here and so on. But of course, I'm sitting in my conservatory at home speaking to you, which is a slightly strange experience. But it's delightful to be talking to you all. And I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation. And as Andy says, I one day would very much like to come and see you all in person. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about Ovid in art, and I'm going to talk about one particular response to Ovid, especially, which is this famous sculpture by Gian Bernini, which of course I'm sure you'll all have seen and be aware of. I'm going to talk a little bit at the beginning, just in kind of general terms, about the statue and its immediate context of making and its intellectual context, and then broaden out to think a little bit about its relationship with Ovid and its kind of wider intellectual milieu. So the sculpture is one of four that Gian Bernini executed for Scipione Borghese, who was one of his most important early patrons between 1618 and 1624, the others being the Aeneas and Anchises and Ascanius leaving Troy, the David, and the Rape of Preserpena. The statues were made for semi-public display at the Villa Borghese, where they remain to this day. And it's worth stressing at the outset that Bernini was born in 1598, so he was only sort of 19, nearly 20 when he began work on these commissions. So they really are just an extraordinary artistic achievement. They showcase, as they were clearly, I think, very self-consciously designed to do, his extraordinarily precocious mastery of the sculptor's art, and something he'd attained already at this very young age. In the rest of his career, Bernini executed projects on a much larger scale. Most obviously, one thinks of things like the baldacchino in St. Peter's and the sculptures of Longinus and the Church Fathers that are in St. Peter's as well. And he also executed sculptures that sought to represent, on his understanding at least, much more elevated moments of, in particular, religious experience, most famously the ecstasy of Santa Teresa in Santa Maria della Vittoria, and the Blessed Ludovica in San Francesco a Ripa, both in Rome. But nevertheless, these early sculptures remain some of his best known and most celebrated works. And the Apollo and Daphne is perhaps the most renowned of the four, and is often kind of cited as a supreme example of Bernini's virtuosic manipulation of marble. And it doesn't take much of a look at the sculpture to see why that's the case. The image of Daphne's hands kind of being transformed into leaves, the borders between human and plant, the sort of the transition between body and tree, are just completely extraordinary, as are the facial expressions. And these features of the sculpture continue to evoke wonder today, as they did, if the early biographical tradition can be trusted, in Bernini's own time when the sculpture was first unveiled. And anybody who's stood by the statue and watched spectators' reactions to it can attest to this fact. And as evidence of this, I've given you here this picture of me looking at the sculpture when I last went to Rome in 2019. Unfortunately, you can't see the look of kind of awestruck wonder on my face, but believe me, it's there. So what I want to do today is to think a little bit about the connections between the sculpture, Ovid's account of the Apollo and Daphne myth in the Metamorphoses, which was of course one of Bernini's kind of primary sources for this sculpture, and one of the texts that would have been uppermost in the minds of spectators looking at this sculpture, as of course it is today. And also the epigram composed about and for the statue by the then Cardinal Mathea Barbarini, who was later to become Pope Urban VIII and one of Bernini's most important patrons. And basically what I want to do is to illuminate something of how the statue was and might have been viewed by its early audiences, and in particular to think about the kind of psychological demands that the statue makes on its viewers. So in order to do that, I want to start by looking briefly at this statue by Mathea Barbarini. Can everyone see this clearly, by the way? Is there some way of perhaps moving slightly this? Yes, I think that's, can everyone see that okay? Yeah, okay, super. This is the epigram that is now on the base of the statue. So I'll just give you a few seconds just to ponder the glories of this epigram before I talk about it. So according to a letter that Bernini himself wrote in 1665, so 40 years or so after the event, the occasion of the epigram's composition was a visit paid to the villa by Mathea Barbarini in the company of the French Cardinal Escobleur de Cerdy. And the rather serious-minded Frenchman clearly didn't take particularly well to Bernini's sculpture, and at least purported to be somewhat disturbed by its lascivious and erotic implications. And apparently, according to Bernini, Mathea Barbarini responded with this moralizing epigram. And the epigram's moralizing interpretation of the sculpture can clearly and very obviously be seen as a kind of rebuttal of the charge that the sculpture is celebrating pagan immorality and the lascivious display of sexuality, diffusing any invitation to a kind of lascivious eroticism. The epigram positions the statue as a purveyor of a kind of moral precept, a moral truth. But far from being a piece of kind of one-dimensional and sort of po-faced moralizing, I want to suggest that the epigram is designed to provoke reflection on the process of spectatorship, and also works as a kind of lens through which we can read Ovid's account of the myth, among other things. And that's that argument is going to form the core of what I'm going to say in most of this talk, and in doing so I'm going to be building on and adding to previous scholarly discussion of the epigram and the statue as a unit. So a few words about the epigram first of all. So two primary senses I think are in play here. The first is that earthly beauty is fugitiva because it's temporal, it's realized in development and change. And the second is that beauty manifest in changing bodies and enjoyed only temporarily is implicitly kind of counterposed to spiritual beauty, the truths revealed through the Christian faith. Daphne is made to stand for worldly beauty of the sort that lovers in general, quisquis amants, pursue. And it's worth noting, I think, that quisquis amans very easily reads as a response to the specifically pagan concept of amor as erotic attachment that Ovid dramatizes. So this amans is very much not a kind of Christian concept, I think. So I'm going to just look briefly at a couple of the ways in which the epigram has been interpreted in in scholarship. So first, this quotation from Rudolf Primusberger, a very well-known Bernini scholar, who relates the epigram to its kind of immediate socio-political and artistic context, and does so as part of an analysis of the four sculptures in their initial context. So he sees a contrast between the David, the fatto storico sacro, and the fatto favoloso of the Apollo and Daphne. And then he analyzes the epigram in that kind of context. So the epigram is about the brevity and bitterness of sensual pleasure, and it's also about the bitter fame that comes from worldly sensual poetry, according to Primusberger. So on this reading, the epigram takes a side in the contemporary debate about the merits of Marinismo, the sensuous and worldly poetry of Giambattista Marino, who himself had recently written about Daphne to much acclaim, but also opposition. And Mathea Barbarini is part of a group of writers and intellectuals who sort of push back against what they see as being the excessive kind of lasciviousness of Marino's poetry and his treatment of classical myth in particular. This discussion by Andrea Bolland from an article that came out 20 years ago this year sort of brings out, sort of builds on this reading and brings out further elements of the epigram's kind of creative ambiguity. I'll just give you a moment to read that. So she picks up on the double meaning of fugitivus, understood as a comment on the artwork's content, fugitivae formae, which can, of course, mean a fleeting beauty as well as fugitive beauty or fleeting beauty, neatly captures the specific instance and the category to which it belongs. It captures the fact that Daphne is a fleeing beauty, but also that such beauty is always fugitiva, in that it belongs to the sublunary world of flux and change and aging. That's roughly Bolland's argument, and she makes various other observations as well. To that, I want to add that as an epigram about a statue, I think Barbarini's distich also reads as a kind of general comment about the sensuous qualities and surfaces, forma of the artwork itself. So despite being fixed and unchanging, the statue and our experiences of it are fugitiva insofar as they belong to the sublunary world. And in another sense, fugitiva forma comments on the kind of enchanting success of Bernini's invention, which is a fixed forma that appears fleeting, it impresses us because of the sort of brilliance of its artistic execution. So the epigram's wording, I think, deftly registers the statue's entrancing power, its creation of illusion, while also hinting at the at least potentially corrupting and morally deleterious effects that experiencing the artwork might bring about. Insofar as we, as spectators, are drawn to linger on the extraordinary forma that Bernini has created, we're in danger, the epigram contrives to suggest, contrives to remind us when we read it, we're in danger of being carried away by a state of erotic affectation that involves pursuing gaudia, pursuing the kind of sensuous delight of looking. And lest one think that this sense in which the fugitivae gaudia formae can describe our experience as viewers, lest one think this is slightly kind of far-fetched or sort of pushing the epigram too far. I think it's worth remembering that the trope of a statue kind of abolishing the gap between artifice and reality to such an extent that the onlooker feels for a statue the same emotions that you would feel for the real thing that it represents, is very well established in Italian poetry of the 16th century. So, for instance, perhaps the most sort of famous instance of this kind of poetry, or well-known instance, is the series of poems written about Jambalonia's Rape of the Sabine Women, Rape of the Sabine Woman, sorry, which is currently located in the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence. So there are various epigrams about this that describe this sense of being borne away by a kind of erotic thrill, in just the same way that the woman in the statue is being borne away. So this idea, I think, is quite common in poetry of the time, and I think it's one of the things that this epigram is kind of alluding to and pushing back against. So for the state of effective pursuit that we might be drawn into as viewers, the epigram substitutes, or tries to substitute, the experience of enlightened contemplation of which it is the result. That by offering itself as the outcome of gleaning moral understanding from the statue and paying tribute to the statue as a kind of vehicle for such understanding, the epigram enacts, or attempts to enact, an alternative to the feeling of erotic abandonment that the statue might generate. So that's my sort of basic kind of take on what the epigram is doing. And in order to kind of build on this and think a little bit more specifically about how the epigram relates to Ovid's account of the myth, I want to just elaborate a couple of further developments. So various scholars, Andrea Bolland in particular, have noted the kind of intertextual background of Mathea Barbarini's epigram, and have noted that obviously the Apollo and Daphne theme was kind of well established in Renaissance poetry, and we can see Barbarini kind of alluding to various of these poetic realizations of the story. So Bolland focuses on two of these in particular. The first here from Petrarch's Rima Sparsa, where the laurel kind of figures the kind of frustrations of worldly love, and the second, an epigram by Poliziano, which kind of responds specifically to Ovid and kind of picks up on the ending of Ovid's account, in which Apollo kind of vainly embraces the tree and gives us an even more bitter kind of experience than Ovid gives us. So the kind of intertextual background of the epigram has been pretty well explored, but what I want to suggest here is a specific intertextual connection with Ovid, between Barbarini's epigram and Ovid, which, so far as I can tell, hasn't yet been noticed in the scholarship. So the second line of the epigram, I'll come on to that passage in a minute. The second line of the epigram, let me just go back to this briefly. So, fronde manus implet bacchus su capita maras, obviously recalls and sort of puts a different spin on Ovid's picture of Apollo attempting to embrace the transformed Daphne. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I also want to suggest that the first line of the epigram draws on Ovid's picture of the pursuit. So as well as constituting a kind of moral reading of sculpture and of the episode as a whole, I want to suggest that quisque sonans sequitur fugitivae gaudia formae is a kind of rejoinder to this moment in the narrative, and specifically to the point at which Ovid draws out the connection between flight and beauty most closely. So the final half line that I've quoted here, aucta fugar form est, her beauty was enhanced by flight. So I'll just give you a moment to look at these lines, which I'm going to talk about briefly. So in Ovid's account, aucta forma refers to kind of moments of perceptual plenitude in which characteristics are revealed with a particular intensity. So we see the dazzling surface of Daphne's body sharpened by the wind, nudabant corpora venti, and we see the light delicacy of her hair being accentuated when it's blown backwards by the breeze. So beauty is increased by flight here, I think, not just in the sense that elusiveness heightens desire. We kind of long for what we can't have, which of course becomes a really crucial feature of Petrarch's erotic poetry, and it's one of the reasons why the image of the laurel is so important for Petrarch in Remus Sparsa 6 and elsewhere. Beauty here isn't just heightened by elusiveness, but beauty is increased by flight because flight allows the features that make Daphne what she is, at least qua subject of erotic desire, to show up more clearly. But what I want to suggest is that Barbarini's epigram about fugitiva forma picks up on aucta fugar form est, and that under the pressure of the epigram, the stakes of aucta fugar form est are changed. So when we read or reread this passage of Ovid through Barbarini's interpretation, we are enabled to kind of relate to it differently, because on Barbarini's kind of understanding, all sublunary forma is necessarily fugitiva, is necessarily kind of fleeting and temporal. The realizations of forma in perception that Ovid documents in this passage with nudabant corpora venti and other phrases can only kind of constitute intensifications of this underlying and constitutive accidental quality, right? So instead of being, when read through the lens of Mathea's epigram, Ovid's moments reveal not intensified characteristics, but the kind of turbulent instability of the phenomenal realm, a realm that's defined by kind of its accidental quality. So I think by echoing this passage of Ovid, Ovid's wording, Mathea kind of points us towards a different way of engaging with not just the overall kind of the large concepts of this myth, but also of its detailing. So I want to move on now to talk about another aspect of the statue, and I want to begin with this comment by Paul Borolsky on the kind of self-referential quality of the statue, which has drawn much attention in recent times. So I'll just give you a minute to read through this this passage. So I've quoted this passage in part to kind of point a contrast with what I want to explore in the remainder of this talk, namely the idea of the statue as an agent of a kind of psychological encounter. So Borolsky and Andrea Bolland in the article I've quoted earlier, put a lot of emphasis on the statue as a kind of self-referential construct, as about the process of artistic creation and artistic looking. And I think there's a lot in that. I think it's a perfectly sensible and well justified way of seeing the sculpture. But what I want to do is to explore a kind of different aspect of the statue's kind of capacity to make us reflect on what's at stake in the processes of viewing. And as I say, I want to do that by thinking about the kind of psychological encounter that the statue precipitates. And what I want to suggest is that momentariness is crucial to this aspect of the sculpture. The sense that this sculpture depicts a very specific kind of instant in time. And I think this sense of the momentary shows up very nicely by contrast with Ovid. The crucial point here is that the sculpture puts much more emphasis than Ovid does on Apollo's touch alighting on the moment of transformation and of the experience of a kind of hybrid tactility that this transformation creates and enables. So with Bernini's focus on this particular kind of moment of transformation, I think we can usefully contrast Ovid's account of Apollo continuing to feel amour for Daphne even after her transformation. So I'll give you a moment or two just to look through this lovely passage from near the end of Ovid's account. So Ovid here stresses the continuance of prior feelings across the metamorphic divide. Hanc quoque foibus amat. With oscula dat ligno, he pressed his lips upon the wood. Ovid shows Apollo attempting to overcome the kind of ontic distinction between him and Daphne that has arisen as a result of her metamorphosis by extending to the transformed Daphne the gestures of affection that are appropriate to interactions between human beings or gods and mortals. Anthropomorphic affection. In the wood shrinking from the kiss, re fugit tamen oscula lignum, we are enabled as readers to sense a kind of compound agency as something of Daphne's human recalcitrance to physical affection, or at least erotic affection, lingers in the body of the tree and motivates it. And of course, this is the feature of Ovid's account to which Policiano's epigram responds. So his si quoque mutata frua picks up on Ovid's hanc quoque foibus amat, and Policiano presents us with a more kind of stubbornly sensuous Apollo than Ovid's, who's rewarded with an even more bitter kind of experience than Ovid's counterpart. So, than his Ovidian counterpart. So with this kind of account of the kind of attempt to extend affection through and after the metamorphosis, we can contrast the kind of moment at which Bernini poises us, his viewers, and it's that effective momentariness that I want to think about here, just in sort of in closing. So by poising his viewers at this moment when transformation is beginning and its effects are beginning to be felt, and by creating these facial expressions that hint beguilingly at the interior lives of the characters that he's represented, or perhaps even strongly assert the interior lives of these characters, Bernini, I think, draws his viewers into a complex kind of psychological encounter. And again, this has been talked about a little bit in the scholarship by Andrea Bolland in particular, but I think more more remains to be said about this. And I want to do that by focusing on Apollo's hand in the left-hand image there, and Daphne's facial expression shown in both of these images. So Apollo's left hand touches both skin with his thumb and bark, as we can see there. But Bernini's very deliberately placed Apollo's hand at the juncture at which Daphne is transformed. He's sensing her transformation, but he's also sensing her as, in this particular moment, constituted by both tree and or the beginnings of the tree and the human body. The look of wonder, touched with a kind of incomprehension and surprise, by which Apollo's countenance begins to be transfigured, suggests, I think, that his tactile experience is a strange and arresting and distinctive and disturbing one. It's one that enables a fleeting, intuitive, literally grasp, understanding of Daphne's uncanny, momentarily dual mode of being that realizes itself in this particular moment, but which will, of course, very quickly be lost as her metamorphosis is completed. Andrea Bolland, in her article, talks about the way in which there's a contrast here between touch and sight. So Apollo sees Daphne's sort of head and face and hair as still human, but his touch tells him that something more is happening, that she's being transformed into a tree. So touch here at this moment becomes kind of more reliable than sight. It kind of shows Apollo what's actually happening. And she relates that, interestingly, to Renaissance debates about the kind of hierarchy of the senses, the reliability of sight, and so on. And of course, the touch as a kind of vehicle of understanding has obvious kind of implications for the sculptor and for sculpture as a kind of vehicle of understanding. But what I would sort of emphasize here is the kind of peculiarity of the understanding that touch enables Apollo to have at this particular moment. And I think Daphne here is even more complex as a kind of affordance for a kind of psychological encounter. So she obviously cries out, as we can see here. Her open mouth obviously indicates that, and she's crying out in part, obviously, because Apollo is touching her, but in part because of this transformation that she's undergoing. So what is the precise nature of this cry, I think, is one of the questions that we're meant to be asking when we confront this statue. Is it primarily an expression of terror at her impending rape by this horrible pursuer that she's trying vainly to evade? Or does it combine that fear with an incipient awareness of her transformation, that something strange and probably quite horrifying is happening to her? What I want to suggest here is that the shape of her mouth is quite ambiguous and ambivalent, and can be, I think, read as having slightly different kind of implications from different angles. I think her mouth can be read not simply as distended in a kind of scream of pure anguish or fear, but as slightly softened by the beginnings of what Ovid calls the torpor, the kind of heavy vegetal drowsiness that takes over her limbs as she's transformed. And I think that's particularly to the fore in the image there on the left. But I think her expression appears slightly different from different angles. So, as I say, I think in the image on the left there, you might disagree with this, I'm not sure, but in the image on the left, I think the languor, the torpor is slightly more prevalent. But I think in the image on the right there, so looking at her head and kind of semi profile, it seems to me that the shape of the mouth is such that it more obviously connotes a kind of fear or anguish. And so what I want to suggest is that Bernini has sort of created an image that resonates slightly differently from slightly different angles. One of the sort of ongoing debates in the scholarship about these statues has to do with how they were placed in their rooms. The sort of traditional communis opinio is that Bernini designed these sculptures to be placed against the walls of the rooms in which they were situated, and as such, they're a kind of implicit riposte to Mannerist sculpture, particularly that of Jambalonia, but also Michelangelo and others as well, which was designed to be looked at from different angles in the round. But even if that's the case, and some people have argued against that recently, even if that's the case, I think one can still circle around the sculptures in a semicircle and see them from different angles. And I think it seems to me that the kind of implication of Daphne's facial expression somewhat changes as one goes through that process. And one can draw parallels, I think, between the different kinds of experiences that you have of the other sculptures when you circle them. You see kind of different things and focus on different elements of them. But however we make sense of Daphne's facial expression, 2 points I think are particularly important. So the first is that the statue opens up an event of viewing. The process of looking at the statue from different angles and feeling ourselves appealed to by slightly different kind of valences or implications in Daphne's expression, affording a range of different perspectives on the single kind of suspended moment that its surface commemorates. The sculpture allows us to marvel at the sheer kind of range of thoughts and feelings and changes that are or might be occurring in this particular instance. So it kind of makes the moment multiple, as it were. The second and kind of simpler point is that being drawn into the contents of another's consciousness, I think, is a key part of this statue's appeal. The statue invites us, I think, to experience this uncanny and strange event from within, as it were, by trying to imagine the interior experiences that the participants are undergoing. So, in other words, I don't think this statue is simply a piece of kind of supremely crafted artifice at whose surfaces we're meant to marvel. I think it's also a sculpture that is meant to project us into the imaginative lives, the kind of experiences that the characters are undergoing. I think this is true of the other sculptures in the Villa Borghese as well, but perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, and perhaps in slightly less kind of sophisticated and demanding ways. The representation of Aeneas and Anchises, for example, is, I think, slightly more kind of psychologically straightforward. So anyway, to bring things to a close, looking at the epigram, the statue, and Ovid together, has, I hope, enabled an appreciation of the complex set of interpretative and effective possibilities that Bernini's creation opens up. And I've obviously thought specifically about two kind of strands of this, and there are plenty of others that I've only very briefly touched on. Mathea Barbarini's Epigram, which self-consciously appeals to the well-established tradition of reading pagan myths allegorically for the moral truths that they imply, shows itself as the outcome of a process of moral reflection and encourages viewers to unfold its implications for themselves. But I don't think for all its kind of cleverness, the epigram quite does justice to the demands that the sculpture makes on viewers' capacities for imaginative participation. And what I want to kind of emphasize in conclusion is that Ovid, I think, in some ways is more useful as a frame for this particular aspect of the sculpture, for kind of attuning us to the sculpture's capacity to engender a kind of imaginative participation, than the epigram and probably than the some of the Renaissance poetry that we've looked at as well. And that's because with phrases like the wood fled, the kisses, or recoiled from the kisses, and other elements of that passage, Ovid draws us in, I think, to the sheer strangeness of the emotional and kind of cognitive situation that the metamorphosis creates. Ovid makes us feel the strangeness of the situation quite intensely. Bernini, by allowing a momentary response to metamorphosis to show itself in these suspended gazes and expressions, I think continues this element of Ovid's project. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tom, for that talk. What I propose to do now is I'm going to do that now. And are there any questions for Tom? Perhaps I'll kick off with one, Tom, if I may, which is you referred to this statue as a sort of part of a debate in the Renaissance world. You quoted some epigrams. My question would be, why did Bernini choose this particular myth as opposed to any other? I mean, there are oodles of them in Ovid, so was this one something that the Renaissance were very keen on, or was it just where he saw he could put out his skill in carving?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there are probably numerous answers to it. I mean, one is, I suspect that it was something that Scipione Borghese probably asked for. As we know, commission of artworks is always a process of kind of engagement and interaction between artist and patron. At this stage, obviously, Bernini wasn't that well established, although he was clearly a bit of a wunderkind. He probably would have had a certain amount of freedom in certainly the execution of his projects. But I suspect that Scipione Borghese probably wanted it, and I suspect that he wanted it in part because it's it's a well-established theme in Renaissance art. There are plenty of representations of it. So I suspect that part of the reason why Scipione Borghese would have wanted this is because it's sort of one of the things that you ought to have if you're a kind of serious collector, have in your possession. I think that Bernini would have been enthusiastic about this because it affords him just a fantastic opportunity to show off how extraordinary a carver he was. I mean, obviously the transformation of Daphne's hands and feet into roots and leaves are one of the great moments in the history of Western art, and you can just imagine how much Bernini would have enjoyed executing that and showing off his skill. There's a wonderful anecdote in the earliest life of Bernini, which talks about the extent to which he would become imaginatively immersed in the process of executing his sculptures. People would try and get him to stop for lunch, and he'd say, just leave me alone. He could work for 6-7 hours at a time, just completely immersed in the joy of carving. And well, that might be a slight exaggeration, but you can clearly you can very easily imagine how he would have, relished the challenge of executing this work. I think that there's probably also a kind of meta-poetic, meta-artistic kind of thing going on as well, in the sense that Apollo is obviously the god of poetry and sort of artistic, in a more extended sense of kind of artistic inspiration. So you can quite easily see how Bernini would have been sort of excited by the prospect of doing this sculpture, because it enabled him to make a kind of comment on his own capacities as a sculptor, and it, to rival Ovid, to create effects that poetry can't create, and more generally in the ways that I've been describing, to sort of enact a process of reflecting on what's at stake when we look at sculptures or read poems. So I think it offers various different avenues, I think, for sort of artistic self-display.
Thanks very much, Tom. Can I just ask, as a sort of follow-up, I mean, there are other versions of this story out there. You fix very firmly and understandably on the likes of Ovid. Can we see this work informed by other classical writers as well, or is it purely, do you think, a take from Ovid's Met?
I'm not sure that Bernini would have had access to other classical representations of this. No, I mean, I think that the text that would have been uppermost in the minds of Bernini and his immediate contemporaries would have been Ovid first and foremost, and then some of the things that I've quoted on this handout, but also I think the tradition, which I didn't talk about today, really, but that Andrea Bolland mentions, of seeing Daphne as a kind of emblem for chastity. So I think that's another kind of tradition that would have been in people's minds, I think, when they were looking at this.
Thanks very much. But any more questions? Yes, Angela.
Yeah.
We need to unmute Angela, or to unmute herself.
Am I unmuted now?
You are.
Yep. Okay. One thing that struck me about the sculptures is there's a certain eroticism about them. And I was quite interested in what you said about the numerous nuances around both the text and the sculpture. The sculptures themselves are beautiful, but they depict something that is quite horrific, which is a rape. And yet, we're supposed to admire the sculpture. And there's something going on there which is slightly, I don't know, moral and amoral, if you like.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, clearly Mathea's epigram is at one level an attempt to kind of diffuse and turn in a more morally productive direction, as he sees it, the kind of thoughts and anxieties that you're giving voice to there. He's sort of saying that we shouldn't go too far down the line of seeing this as erotic. I mean, I think it's important to bear in mind the kind of suprahuman sort of dimension of this story that's very clearly foregrounded in Ovid, which is an account that obviously kind of transposes this story very firmly into not just the mythical register, but also into a kind of hyperbolic register, right? So obviously Apollo and Daphne are both struck by Cupid's darts, one that compels love and one that compels a desire for chastity. So they're both, like, right from the start of the narrative, they're both subject to forces greater than themselves. They're both acting as almost as a sort of vehicles for agency, not their own, right? So I think there's a strong sense in Ovid in that framing of the story leads us to interpret what happens in metaphorical, or certainly not strictly literal terms, right? So this isn't simply the story of desire and its frustration and, you know, its attempted execution. It's also, in a sense, an allegorical story about, you know, well, Ovid as using Apollo as a poetic figure. You know, the kind of the way in which individual agency can be kind of dictated by forces that are outside the individual's control, and so on and so forth. And that's that kind of allegorical kind of element of the story, which I think is there implicitly in Ovid, is then kind of picked up by Christianizing interpretations, seeing Daphne as an allegory for charity and so on. So I think you know, one of the things that's distinctive about Bernini's sculpture is both that it kind of draws us into this this kind of very sensuous appreciation of bodies, as you say, but it also, I think, makes very salient the fact that what we're addressing here belongs to a kind of supra-real dimension of reality, right? And there are lots of ways in which this manifests itself. And perhaps the most obvious one is the echo in Apollo's face and kind of bodily disposition of the very famous Apollo Belvedere, which of course, you know, Bernini and his contemporaries all known very well. So there's a strong sense in which this isn't just Apollo. This is, you know, an Apollo that has been that's the product of a long kind of artistic tradition. You know, so we're not looking, as it were, at something real. We're looking at a series of fictions. So I think I think the sense that we're looking at something real is kind of both it's both foregrounded but also disrupted, I would say.
Stephen.
Can I follow on from that with something I was going to ask anyway, but it's picked it up rather more with Angela's question and what you've come back with. In particular, the tangibility of the statue compared with a painting. Because I was going to ask simply, to what extent do you think that you'd have had to take a different view if you'd been talking to us about Ovid in relation to a painting of a scene from myth?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think there are various paintings of the Apollo and Daphne myth, obviously by Rubens and by Tiepolo and others, that I think create effects that are analogous to some extent to those I was describing here. I mean, I think one of the things that runs through the pictorial tradition is an interest in Daphne's, in particular Daphne's, but also Apollo's, facial expressions as connoting different kinds of mood. And, you know, one sees very clearly the different painters kind of differentiating their versions from one another and showing Daphne in particular in very different lights. So in some, she's really very angry, whereas in Tiepolo, she almost has this kind of serene calm. She's being kind of transported into a higher plane of reality or something. That representation is very easily read in the light of the Christian kind of allegorical tradition, Daphne as a figure of chastity and so on. But I think what the paintings obviously don't afford is this kind of 3D experience, right? Which I think you're alluding to there with the tangibility, right? I mean, so obviously I think the sculpture affords you this possibility of moving around the sculpture and seeing it from different angles. Obviously, I discussed some of what I see of the consequences of that in the talk, but another I think really sort of strong element of or effect rather of that process, which again isn't there in paintings to anything like the same degree, is the sense you have as a viewer that you never quite get the whole story of the sculpture, right? Because you're always looking at it from a particular angle, and you're always occluding, some features of the sculpture when you look at it from your particular position. I don't think there's any kind of right way, right position from which to look at the sculpture. And I think that's that sense of it kind of receding from one's grasp, if you like, of sort of offering something of itself from one angle, but withholding other things, is quite an important part of how we experience it. And again, I think that's something that Bernini's keenly aware of in the way he's way he's designed it. You know, one obvious feature of that. Let me just I'm just going to bring the sculpture back to demonstrate this point. I mean, one very conspicuous feature of the sculpture is the way in which Daphne almost appears to be sort of taking off, right, taking flight, because she's raised slightly. There's this wonderful paradox that, you know, she's being glued back into the earth by becoming a tree, but there's also a sense in which she's being kind of lifted up into the air. And I think that that quality is more obvious from some angles than others. So that's just one instance, I think, of how the sculpture sort of looks very different from different angles.
Any more questions? Jeff, you'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself, Jeff, unless I can do it for you.
Have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Trying to unmute myself on the screen. I just want to skim through Bernini's sort of output. And obviously he covered other classical themes as well as sort of contemporary ones. But did he do any other work that was as strongly based on Ovid as this one is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the most obvious one is the Rape of Preserpena, which is from the same period and was done for the same patron. And obviously today it's in the Villa Borghese, quite near the Daphne. I mean, the extent to which it's influenced by Ovid is an interesting one, because I mean, Ovid, it shows the moment at which Hades, or Pluto rather, is sort of carrying Proserpina away. That's not a bit of the myth that Ovid describes in lots of detail. I mean, he kind of glides over that particular bit quite quickly. Obviously, we get a very extended description of what Milton called that fair field of Enna, where Proserpine gathering flowers, etc. So we get a long description of that, but he doesn't focus so much on the actual moment of capture and taking away. So I don't think the sort of relationships between that sculpture and Ovid's version of the myth are quite as kind of extensive as those between the Apollo and Daphne and Ovid's version are. But that's the that's the kind of the other obvious sort of Ovidian moment in Bernini's oeuvre.
Any further questions? I hope my sound is now working. Stephen warned me it'd gone off a little bit, but I hope it...
Yeah, it sounds fine now.
Yeah, it's good, yeah.
So are there any further questions for Tom, or are we done for this afternoon? It looks like I think that we're done, so let's give Tom a rest, and before we let him go, say once again thank you very much for coming and indeed persisting in trying to come here. We're very, very grateful, and maybe one day we will see you in the flesh, so to speak.
I very much hope so. Thank you all very much for coming along. It's been great to see you.